Hey, everybody. All right. So today we are going to be continuing with our coastal habitats discussion. This is part two of three total parts that we're going to be working through. We are today going to be talking about mangroves, mudflats, and seagrasses. And so let's get started. All right, so I want to backtrack because you remember last time we ended talking about red mangroves, and I want to backtrack through that a little bit. There's a couple things maybe I don't think I've hit quite as well as I would like to, so I want to be sure you've got a good understanding there. Um, and part of that has to do with zonation. So among the species that of mangrove that you'll find here, at least in Texas, red mangrove is one of those two that you'll find on the upper Texas coast, and as we're going to talk about, it's one that's moving more northward. But in any event, if we look at zonation of mangroves, so here again, let me get my pointer. There we go. All right, so if you look at zonation of mangroves, so from downslope to upslope, and so today we're going to be starting downslope and kind of working our way up. Red mangrove likes to be in that intertidal zone. It is of the mangroves, it likes to grow along the lowest edge of the shoreline. So you'll find it in that kind of the same intertidal area that you'll find Spartina alterniflora that we talked about last class period. So red mangrove is characterized, number one, by heavily suberized roots. So you remember suberin, and it can block up to 99% of that salt uptake. The other thing that's very noticeable with red mangrove are its aerial root structures. And again, aerial roots, these prop roots, are an adaptation to anoxic sediments. And in this case, they're covered with lenticels and they do include parenchyma. So you can see over in these photos some pictures of where these mangroves like to occupy. So in these particular areas, these are along what would otherwise be cut shorelines growing out over. This looks like a stream in this particular area. Okay, so with red mangrove, you have vivipary. Um, Here the seeds sprout and emerge from the fruit, and they elongate up to about 30 centimeters, right? See my fingers there? Yeah, okay. So about 30 centimeters into these long propagules. Um, so you can see the fruit here in this picture on the left-hand side, and then you can see the propagules here, how they have grown out of the fruit and extended downwards. And essentially, the way this works is that seed the radical forms into the root structure. The hypocotyl forms and elongates into the stem. Now, when these propagules are finally released from the tree, okay, so remember vivipary occurs where that seed is supported while it's on the tree. Once these propagules release from the tree, they float, and they'll float until they find the right place in order to establish roots. Okay, so you can kind of get a sense of what this looks like through its various stages. So on the tree, you have that immature hypocotyl emerging from the fruit, and eventually it elongates, and then once it's released from the tree, it'll develop leaves. This section here will develop into the trunk, and here you'll get the roots down on the bottom. So this is what would be actually what would establish on or would be established on the shoreline, which would look like these guys here. Okay, so a couple different pictures of these, right? You got the leaves, that stem that was the center part of that propagule, and then the roots underneath the soils or in the sediments, or in this case, actually looks like it embedded in some rock. So as I mentioned, red mangrove, these rhizophora are in fact expanding northward. This is a byproduct of climate change and warming conditions in the Gulf of Mexico. Um, this could potentially be problematic. We don't know. It has a distinct there's a distinct opportunity there for shoreline habitats and these low marshes to be somewhat reshaped. As we mentioned last class period, mangroves can have the impact of overgrowing Spartina. And even though they occupy the same space, especially in the case of Rhizophora, they do have slightly different ecologic niches, and the way the marshes function is slightly different with these two different plants. So it could be problematic in some of these marshes, and you certainly do see some displacement. So we're again seeing northward movement into central Texas, and so let me see here. So we've got Rhizophoria, and here we've got it even. This graphic is showing it as far north as Corpus Christi Bay. Now, I personally am not aware of this in the Galveston Bay area. Again, mostly what I see in my work has been the Abyssinia that we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes, but I had mentioned that previously as well. Oh, well, here we go. So Abyssinia germinans or black mangrove. This one occupies the next. This occupies the next zone, a little bit higher upslope. So occurs above Rhizophora. The scrub forms are fairly common along our coastlines here in the northern part of the coast. Usually these are 1 to 2 meters tall. I will tell you, I've seen some larger ones, but they do mostly, at least again to my experience, tend to be on the lower side of that. So they tend to be shorter rather than taller. Um, they do tend to get larger with warmer climates. One of the things here on this part of the Texas coast is we do have regular freezes, so it is not unusual for us to see a freeze every winter, and sometimes really extreme freezes. You certainly remember the one in 2022, no doubt. So in Galveston, a lot of times you'll see, again, these are typically on the shorter side, a meter or so. But if you get down south of here, down towards Port Aransas, you'll see them 3 meters tall or more in some cases. In Florida, I did not take these photos. I have not personally seen Abyssinia this large, but I've been led to believe that they can be over 10 meters tall. So again, how often they see freezes. There's other factors involved with this as well, but certainly winter conditions are a factor of that. The warmer it is, the more consistent those warm temperatures are, the larger the trees can be. These trees are also characterized by aerial root structures, but in this case, instead of prop roots, we have pneumatophores. But here again, this is an adaptation to anoxic sediments. These again are covered with lenticels and do contain parenchyma. Okay, so you can see those pneumatophores here, and you'll usually see these. So one of my sites in Galveston actually has a stand that has now actually died off because of the 2 years of subsequent really hard freezes. Has died off. You can still see the pneumatophores extending out in front of that into the low marsh. Right. Here again, so you can see those pneumatophores that extend out there. Sometimes the pneumatophores can really be thick in front of there. These are a little more sparse, but you can certainly see them there. So, all right. So, Abyssinia does produce propagules as well. But in this case, it is cryptovivipary. So you get these propagules that are about 3 centimeters. They're kind of lima bean shaped is one way you could describe them, right? So here's one of those propagules here. Now, there is a difference between vivipary and cryptovivipary. Vivipary occurs while on the tree, and the germinating plant actually breaks out of the seed coat. So I showed you when we were looking at the red mangrove rather, excuse me, tongue tied, the rhizophora, that you actually see that breaking out of the seed coat. In the case of cryptovivipary, it still occurs on the tree, but in this case, while the germinating plant breaks out of the seed coat, it doesn't actually break out of the fruit wall. So you don't see that large you don't see that large propagule actually outside of the fruit. That hypocotyl only emerges from the fruit wall once it's been released from the parent tree. So some difference in that sense. So here you can see the red mangrove here. So you've got these propagules, and here again, you see that fruit, you see that long propagule. With the black mangrove, the Avicennia, you do not. We'll talk about white mangroves here in a minute. So once that is released from the tree, you can then start to see the hypocotyl elongating. From there, roots start to form, continued elongation, and then eventually it will root. And you can see the first leaves starting to emerge as well. And so here's a case of a seedling. I know that some of my colleagues with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other entities have done some propagation, particularly with black mangrove. And I've had quite a few students actually do some transplanting with these at the Echo Center, which is up in Baytown. So it's a common plant here. This is the one that you're going to see along the Texas coast. All right, so, or along the North Texas coast, rather. Again, you've got suberized roots. In this case, can block anywhere from about 30 to 90% of salt, but they also have salt excretion glands over the surface of the leaves, right? So if you were to examine the root structures, you would see that suberin layer. And here again, kind of like what you saw with the Spartina when you were in the field, you'll see actually salt excretion on those leaf structures. Okay, so in class, of course, we had our clicker questions, and here, these images depict suberin, so that's in green on mangrove root cross sections. One panel is Avicennia, one is Rhizophora. Which one of these is more likely to be Avicennia? So if you were to suggest A, you would be correct. And the reason why has to do where they are in the marsh. And so and actually where they are in the Gulf of Mexico has some to do with that. But the Rhizophora are lower in the marsh. They are let's see here. They are also because they're not only lower elevation, but they see higher salinities typically, in part because of that. Pardon me. Um, so that suberin layer is higher. Okay. Okay, so of course, in class we had our clicker questions, and so this question is looking at some cross sections of mangrove root, and so one panel is Avicennia, one is Rhizophora. Which panel is more likely to be Avicennia? Well, in this case, it is panel A. So if that's the one you guessed, you got that question right. And again, it tends to be kind of mid-high elevation. And remember, it has kind of two strategies there, whereas the Rhizophora pretty much depends on that suberin, which is much heavier and blocks out more of that salt in the first place. And again, remember that Rhizophora is when we're talking about zonation is lower slope. So it's in water most of the time. All right. So the next species that we're going to look at is white mangrove. And again, here, so we're talking up slope, right? So that would be kind of back in this area. Um, Again, upslope from Abyssinia. So you've got your rhizophora, your red mangrove. You've got your Abyssinia, your black mangrove, and then you've got your Lancularia, which is your white mangrove up from that. Um, there are no characteristic aerial roots with this particular plant, and I think that would make sense based on where they are, right? So they're higher upslope. They're less likely to see those that flooding stress or those anoxic conditions. So they don't need to put energy into that adaptation, right? Now, when they're posed with that, so if there's a condition where they are exposed to flooding stress over an extended period of time, that can stimulate a temporary formation of small pneumatophores or prop roots, but it's not common. That's not the common thing because they tend to be fairly upslope. So if you had the white mangrove in conditions like this, right, up in this top right corner, in those cases, if that were to extend out over a long period of time, that's when you would possibly see some prop roots, which it looks like you can see just a little bit here in this guy. But again, not a real common thing. Most of the time, you're going to find them up in areas that are going to be drier. They do have two types of salt glands. All right. One are these extraflora nectaries. And so these are on the petiole. And that's just kind of pretty interesting. So here are these nectaries right here. And they actually secrete sugars to, and I'm sorry, I refer to these as salt excreting glands. One is a sugar excreting gland. So these nectaries excrete sugars, which attract ants, and the ants then serve a function for the plant in that they protect the plant from herbivores. So this is kind of a really good example of a cooperative relationship among two different species within this particular community. Now, they also have salt excreting glands, and you'll actually see these in lines along the margin of the leaf surface. So they also have cryptoviviparous propagules, usually 3 to 4 centimeters long, and they are ridged. So you can see the shape of these differs from the previous two species fairly significantly, so fairly obvious in this case. Um, and that leads us then to our next species, which are buttonwood, sometimes referred to as button mangrove. So these occur in these upland transitional zones. And in fact, they're often utilized as ornamental plants. The flowers are actually quite attractive. So you can see they've got these kind of button-like flowers. They're, in fact, partly named off because of these flowers and also the seeds. They likewise do not characteristically have aerial roots. Again, there's just not really much need for that because they're just not, they're not subject to those flooding conditions. So here we got again two types of glands, but they're in different locations than the white mangrove, right? So here you've got nectaries around the base of what is a short petiole. So here you've got this right here, and then you've got the salt glands that actually occur near the mid vein. So I don't know if you can see that. Here I'm leaning forward like I can't see it. I can see it fine. You can see it. So kind of in this area where my pointer is, and you'll see that here as well. And here's some more. Okay, so the So again, this button-like appearance of both the flowers and the fruits. Um, so in this case, they don't actually produce these viviparous propagules. Rather, the seed cases are dropped and dispersed by water. Um, so, what do these four mangroves have in common, and how are they different? Well, So, um, in every case, they have some mechanism of dealing with salt, right? So they do have the ability to either block salt out via the suberin in their roots or to excrete salt, typically through their leaves. However, they differ in their zonation. So, where they like to grow, do they like to have their feet wet all the time, or do they not like to have their feet wet at all, kind of thing? Okay. So, consequently, you also see these different adaptations to deal with anoxic conditions. All right. So, okay. This leads us to, again, a clicker question. So when we looked at this in class, I'm showing you now this mangrove, and I'm asking you, is this black mangrove, button mangrove, white mangrove, or red mangrove? Well, if you answered red mangrove, you would be correct. And the big clue here is this propagule, right? And so you can see that great big propagule that has emerged from the fruit here. So this one is probably not too far from dropping off where it's going to float in the water until it finds a suitable habitat in order to be able to root. Okay, so if you got that right, very good. Okay, so here's our second clicker question in this series of two. The um, the question here is what salt management strategy is being displayed by this plant, right? Okay, so knowing this is red mangrove, what do? Well, they're the ones that they live lowest down slope, and they're the ones that have the high amount of suberin in the root. Remember that? And so that would be a form of exclusion. Okay. All right. All right, so let's talk about mudflats for a minute. So, what's a mudflat? Well, mudflats are composed of very fine grained sediments. They are exposed um, only typically at low tide, so they're otherwise submerged during most of the other tides. And the subsurface sediment in these is typically anoxic at a very shallow level because they're typically covered by water. Now, you find these all over the world, so they are a global phenomenon. This photo is from Galveston Bay, and this is typical of the types of mudflats we have. You can see these all along West Bay in both restored and in remnant natural Spartina marshes along West Bay on the Galveston side. Well, and on the Hitchcock and Brazoria County side as well. In any event, we'll get down that road. So, but where you'll usually find them is kind of embedded in the marsh, right? So, if you get back into the marsh a little ways, what happens is the water velocity tends to slow down. So, if you look at this picture, you can see a little bit of a cut here, but by and large, it's a tiny little cut, and the rest of this is very open. Well, what that means is water may be moving relatively rapid during when the tide is coming in and going out, but it's not like a stream, a typical stream, or even many of our bayous where you can have, especially during storm events, really significant concentrated stream flows. And in those stream flows, the smaller sediment particles, so clays and silts particularly, because they're smaller and lighter, they tend to stay up in suspension in the water column in those conditions. But here in these mud flats, where the water velocity really slows down, is that marsh opens up, right? And you get these big kind of open areas of water. That water's moving so slowly that it gives those fine particles an opportunity to slowly fall out of suspension. So you get these muds here that can occur even times in areas that otherwise might have somewhat sandy soil. So if you were to go out here, you might find more sand in the soils. But back in these mudflats, they are actually quite soupy, quite muddy. Um, so this, again, is a good example of what you find in West Bay. If you want to see some of these, great kayaking trip if you launch from the artist boat launch there in Eckerd Bayou. So go down Settegas Road off of Stewart Road, take Settegas down. There's a launch there, and you can go out Eckerd Bayou. And when you get out to kind of the end of Eckerd Bayou into West Bay, especially if you go towards the right, so you're headed east, there's a great big area that's kind of a mix of habitat restoration and habitat preservation associated with the artist boat. And you'll see a bunch of mudflats in there. Great place to watch birds. This is just really remarkable habitat. Again, it's part of that mosaic of habitats that we talked about in previous classes. So you've got some of this low Spartina, alterniflora. This looks like it might be Spartina patens, but don't hold me to that. So you're going to have these typical low marsh plant communities along with these mud flats, and then you'll have some mid-high marsh and even maybe some uplands kind of mixed in, kind of behind the picture here. So kind of this mosaic of habitats really valuable. Now, for the mud flats specifically, one of the things that makes them very valuable is the microphytobenthos, the benthic microalgae that occurs in the sediments. And so there's a variety of these different types of microalgae, and they do form these complex mats that are really down in the sediments and they become part of the sediments, right? So these microalgae are extremely important in terms of helping diffuse oxygen into the surface of the sediments. And so kind of somewhat similar to what Spartina alterniflora does in terms of moving or allowing oxygen to diffuse down into the sediments. So oxygen production in the photic zone is linked to light penetration in the sediments, and that varies depending on how big the sediment particles are, right? So the bigger the particles, the bigger the soils, the bigger the spaces are between the soil particles, right? So these spaces, so if you look between my two hands here, that would be referred to as an interstitial space. So interstitial space, that any of you who've ever studied soils at all would recognize that term. So so you think about riprap, right, along the shoreline, those great big rocks. You can stick your hand way down into those, right? The spaces are huge. Get into smaller gravel, maybe get your finger in there, maybe not. As the soil particles continue to get smaller and smaller, the interstitial spaces get smaller and smaller, and that reduces how far light can penetrate in between those individual soil particles. So typically, soil below the photic zone is usually anoxic. Okay, and you can see that in these photos here. So along the surface, you can see this light brown indicates that there is oxygen there. So, but just a little bit below that, you see how black this is, right? So that black soil, any hydrogen sulfide that you might smell coming out of that, that is that shows where that low oxygen environment is. Okay, so what these microalgae do, these benthic microalgae, is they help oxygen penetrate deeper into those sediments than they might otherwise. So if you look at this photo, you can see this black line here, right? And I've got two images here, night and day. At night, penetration of oxygen down into the sediment is lesser than it is during the daytime. And that's because at night, those microalgae, those sediment microalgae, they're not photosynthesizing, right? So they're not, they're not able to diffuse as much oxygen into those sediments as a result. During the day, however, you can see what a large impact they can have there. And that's important in terms of the other organisms that might occupy those sediments. So think about all of the other benthic invertebrates, for instance, that would live in those sediments that are also part of the bottom of the food web, that are important for nutrient cycling, that sort of thing. All right, so in terms of primary production, we're talking about biomass. Benthic microalgae are really important in that particular role. They're a major food source for deposit feeders and other benthic fauna. And their productivity, their primary productivity is greater than things like phytoplankton that we've talked about, macroalgae that we're going to talk about here in a minute, even the Spartina that we've talked about, those coastal marsh grasses, right? So really important in terms of their role within these communities, specifically in these mudflats. Okay, so we also have macroalgae occurring in these areas. So these mats can actually cover mud flats. And just like the microalgae, they too can influence oxygen cycling and provide trophic support. Okay, so that brings us now to seagrasses. So seagrasses are submerged aquatic vegetation. So you'll often see the acronym SAV or SAV. Submerged aquatic vegetation. These are different than the coastal grasses that we've looked at so far, like Spartina alterniflora, which have an above water component to their biomass, their stems and their leaves. These plants are completely underwater. They are vascular flowering plants, angiosperms, and actually they return to the sea after terrestrial plants evolved. And they're not true grasses. They are monocots, but they're not in the family Poaceae like some of the other grasses that we've looked at. So where are they? Well, so you'll find seagrasses all over globally across temperate and tropical seas. The current extent in Galveston Bay is somewhat limited, although it is recovering. So here you can see from a 2015 survey that Texas Parks and Wildlife did, along with surveys that were done between the 1950s to the 1990s, mapping seagrasses, that there is some expansion that is occurring. That is good, and it is a direct result of improving water clarity, especially in West Bay, but this is true throughout the Upper Bay as well. That has been a result of doing a better job in terms of protecting shorelines, which reduces erosion. That also speaks to better controlling boat wake and prop washing, especially in shallow areas, which has the effect of stirring up those small fine sediment particles in the water and will actually shade those plants out. So so in Galveston Bay, again, they are expanding. And I've seen it particularly in my work here in West Bay. So there are areas where I had projects early on that did not have seagrasses that have really started to, you're starting to see much more of those seagrasses. Again, down there around Eckerd Bayou. And if you go a little further west down towards Snake Island Cove, you'll see extensive seagrass beds that weren't there 25 years ago. They, again, do live fully submerged in these estuarine and marine habitat, and that includes their pollination. And they're also typically associated with soft sediments, which helps in terms of rooting it, among other things in their biologic processes. And they typically live in high light environments, which is going to typically mean shallow environments. So here, this is soft. These are soft sediments, and actually, this is an area that during a really low tide actually becomes exposed. So they can suffer being exposed to the air for short periods of time. But here you can see monitoring that we were doing. This was back in the early 2000s, and my recollection is correct. These are A&M students that we had working for us at GBF. In any event, you can see how shallow they are, and they're actually doing monitoring in some restored seagrass beds. Okay, so when we look at the morphology, these are rhizome-bearing plants. So much like Spartina alterniflora are, right? So they send out these rhizomes, or some people refer to them as root runners. Um, so you've got this horizontal underground stem, actually, right? And it has an apical growing tip. So here, right? So here's your stem, your vertical stem with the leaf structure attached to it. Here you've got your rhizome, or that horizontal stem, and then here you have that apical growing tip. Okay, so you can see that again on this photo. So they typically have relatively short shoots with a lot of leaves. They do have parenchyma, just like the marsh grasses that we've talked about, that have those large air spaces in them. And there's benefits to this because it also provides some flotation. So if you think about it, they're growing underwater, but they still need to get light. So they don't want their leaves along the bottom of the water where they're going to get covered with mud. They want to try, just like every other plant, as much as possible. You want to grow up in order to outcompete your neighbors, partly, but to be sure that you're getting the sunlight that you need to produce biomass. Um, they do not have the substance lignin in their stems. So you would associate lignin with many terrestrial plants. If a plant can grow upright, so the most obvious example are trees, but you see this in most flowering plants. If they can grow upright, typically they have lignin in the cell walls, which stiffens those structures so that they can remain upright. Well, underwater, they don't necessarily need that. In fact, those air spaces are more beneficial because it helps them float, right? And that keeps their leaves flexible enough to be able to tolerate wave action without actually breaking, right? So if you've ever seen a tree in a flood and that tree or shrub snaps, or a high wind is another example of that. That lignin makes them stiff, but it also then can create a hazard of sorts under the right conditions. So if you think about a plant in the water, there's going to be tides going in and out, and other potential factors. So this allows them to tolerate that wave action. They do not have stomata on the leaves. That gas exchange occurs through diffusion directly through the thin porous cuticle. And the chloroplasts are in the epidermis, which means more light exposure to those chloroplasts. All right, so two terms you ought to be familiar with: a ramette and a genet. The ramette is a single individual unit. So if you look at my red box here, that red box is where that ramette, so you've got that single individual unit. This blue box, which should extend all the way over here. I didn't do a good job of that, did I? So you've got a group of ramettes with the same zygote. Okay, so when you look at the roots, seagrass beds have extensive root mats that can be several centimeters thick. This is analogous to what you see in Spartina alterniflora beds, and many other marsh plant species, where they develop these really massive root structures. And that's really valuable. Not only does it provide anchorage for the plants, but it's extremely important in terms of diffusing oxygen down in the sediments, which supports a whole nother world in those sediments, supports a whole nother many levels of trophic organisms as a result. These seagrass beds are really important aquatic habitat for a number of different species, and in part it's because of how they support other other trophic position organisms. Also, interestingly, when you look at the overall biomass of seagrasses in general, only a relatively small portion of that, even though much of the biomass is above the sediment line, only a small portion of it actually is photosynthetic. All right, so again, there are pros and cons to this. When we talk about how thick that root mat is, again, it does provide very secure anchorage, so it can survive a lot of wind currents and I'm sorry, along a lot of strong currents and wave action. And that's kind of in combination again with the lack of lignin in the above sediment structures. So they're very flexible, right? The problem here is that it takes energy to support all that stuff. It's still living material, right? And especially if you're still building root mass over time. So that requires a lot of light in order to photosynthesize enough in order to be able to support all that. So low light levels can be very stressful for seagrass. Low light decreases photosynthesis. That this then can increase production of toxic sulfides in the sediments. More light increases photosynthesis, increases oxygen production, and then increases the conversion of sulfides to sulfates that we covered previously, right? So in this particular picture, you can see how blurry the picture is. That's not a bad photographer. Actually, I didn't take this picture, but this actually is this would give you a good picture of uh, fine-grained sediments stirred up in the water column that would prevent light penetration down into the water, number one. And number two, if those sediments settle out, they could actually cover the leaves of those plants, again, preventing light penetration into where the chloroplasts are on the epidermis. So this is a big part of why we lost so many seagrasses from the 1950s onward. We had subsidence, right? Ground subsidence, so the water was getting deeper in these embayments, which meant the light had to penetrate further down in to those areas. There was more development along these coastal areas, which typically meant more boat traffic, more upland sheet flow runoff. Because of hardened surfaces, the more stream flow. So there is more turbidity in the water overall because of all of these actions. As we've gotten a handle on that, that has started to turn around. So here again, you can kind of see how this process works. Again, where you have high light, you have more oxygen diffusion, and as a result, the sulfides are converted to sulfates, and so those conditions are less toxic in those sediments. Again, very stressful are low light conditions for these submerged aquatic vegetative communities. So one of the things that really makes seagrasses unique is how they pollinate, right? Their entire life cycle is submerged, and this includes pollination. So they have water dispersed pollen. Terrestrial plants, they can pollinate in a variety of ways. In some instances, that pollen is carried by the wind. Those of you with seasonal allergies probably know that very well. They can be pollinated by other organisms. But in the case of seagrasses, it's all water dispersed. There's no animal or wind vector there. And that seed dispersal and germination is also all occurring under the water. There are a few submerged freshwater angiosperms that have hydrophilic pollen, but most still use wind or some sort of animal, typically insects, for dispersal. So water dispersed pollen is actually very rare. It occurs in only 18 out of over 13,000 angiogerm genera. 14 of those 18 are seagrasses. All right, so both the flowers and the pollen have unique adaptations to this hydrophilic lifestyle. The petals are very reduced, right? Or virtually absent. And that's because there's no animals to attract. They don't need to attack. They're not attracting fish like, many flowers in my backyard attract hummingbirds or butterflies. So they don't need those large petals in order to do that. They have these large pollen grains, okay, that have this slime that help it float, and that becomes entangled in the elongated styles. And the flower opening is nocturnal, and this helps increase the pollen supply because it dilutes herbivory risk, okay? So again, very seagrasses are very unique, and again, very important aquatic habitat. So one other thing here is that um, they don't have to reproduce sexually exclusively. They can also reproduce asexually through clonal growth. So I mentioned earlier ramets and genets, right? And so a seagrass clone occurs when you have these ramets that are all being formed one after the other from the same zygote. Okay, so you can see an example of this again here, right, all along. And essentially, this typically occurs in order to accommodate rapid kind of recolonization after a big disturbance event. So if you think about I don't know, maybe you have a storm that creates a lot of erosion within an embayment in an area that may not typically see a lot of erosion, and that might tear some of those plants out, might cover them with sediments. This would allow for these seagrasses not to have to go through all of the process of sexual reproduction, but simply to be able to recolonize quickly. Okay. Um, and so in these colonies, then there aren't really true individuals. They're all genetically identical and they're all connected by this rhizome complex that you see here. Let me use my laser pointer again. So in this area right here. Okay. So, I think that's going to wrap us up for today. We'll pick up here next time. Again, I'll remind you of my student office hours when I'm on campus, but again, I am available via Zoom anytime you have any questions, or I can arrange to meet you on campus if you like. Do continue to look at your lab materials, and you are going to be going in the field again today. So prepare for typical Texas marsh conditions, hot, wet, potentially very wet this week, and maybe a little buggy. Okay. Y'all have a really good time. Have fun. And I will look forward to seeing you next time.